Smells like yesterday's leftovers, the man sneered, pushing away the steaming bowl of soup Tanya had set before him, his voice cutting through the hum of the southern table. Tanya froze, her heart pounding, but her eyes burned with defiance. Would she shrink under his scorn, or rise to forge a legacy? Welcome to a story of grit and grace, where a black woman transforms prejudice into possibility in a small southern diner. Will her fire be enough to change hearts and build a home for all? Stick around to find out. If this tale sparks something in you, hit that subscribe button for more stories of courage and redemption. Drop a comment. Where are you tuning in from? Share your thoughts as we dive into Tanya's journey, one plate at a time. Let's begin. A winter wind howled, sharp as a blade, cloaking the south in frost and secrets. In a humble diner, Tanya, a black woman with fire in her eyes and steel in her spine, set down a bowl of soup, its warmth defying the cold. A customer's sneer cut deep. This reeks of yesterday's scraps. That single barb ignited a spark that would blaze through prejudice and doubt, forging a legacy from the ashes of scorn. What fueled Tanya's defiance? How did one woman's grit transform a table into a beacon of hope? Unravel her story with us. You won't want to miss the twist that changes everything. Hit subscribe to dive into our latest tales of triumph and drop a comment to share where you're watching from. Your voice matters. Lean in and let Tanya's journey set your heart ablaze. The wind howled across the Georgia plains, a bitter gust that swept in from the sea, carrying a fine mist of drizzle and the weight of a sky draped in gray. Winter had settled over the small town like a grudge, frosting the edges of the sprawling fields and chilling the bones of anyone foolish enough to linger outside. Tanya stood at the edge of the main road, her breath clouding in the frigid air, her thick curls tucked beneath a worn scarf. Her eyes, bright and unyielding, scanned the sleepy town, a scattering of clapboard houses, a general store, and a diner with a flickering neon sign. She clutched an old suitcase, its leather cracked from years of use, and felt the familiar ache of hope battling doubt in her chest. She had left the city behind, where sewing jobs had dried up like the dreams they once fed, and now she was here, a black woman in a place that didn't know her name and likely didn't care to learn it. The diner's sign read "The Southern Table," and below it, a handwritten notice was pinned to the door. Help wanted, fair pay, steady work. Tanya's heart quickened, a spark igniting against the cold. She adjusted her coat, too thin for the season, patched at the elbows, and pushed open the door. The bell above jangled, sharp and accusing, and the warmth of the diner hit her like a slap. The air smelled of coffee and fried bacon, but it was the silence that struck her hardest. Conversations paused, forks hovered over plates, and every pair of eyes turned to her. The customers, mostly white, stared with a mix of curiosity and suspicion, their gazes prickling her skin like thorns. A man in a flannel shirt near the door leaned toward his friend, his voice low but not low enough. Bet she's only good for wiping tables and fetching drinks. His friend chuckled, a sound that grated like gravel underfoot. At a corner table, a woman with tightly pinned hair sipped her tea, her lips curling as she muttered, "This ain't the place for cheap eats and rough folk." Tanya's jaw tightened, but she forced a smile, thin and sharp, the kind that shielded her heart without betraying it. She had faced worse than whispers in the city, men who sneered at her work, landlords who raised rent on a whim, but each slight still stung, a reminder of the world she navigated alone. Behind the counter, Henry, the owner, stood wiping a glass with a rag. His face was weathered, his eyes narrow with the kind of caution carved by years of hard winters and harder choices. He looked her up and down, taking in her worn coat, her steady posture, the defiance that burned quietly in her gaze. "You here for the job?" he asked, his voice flat, like he was already half convinced she wouldn't last. "Yes, sir," Tanya replied, her tone even but firm. "I can work. Whatever you need." Henry pointed to a chair in the corner, its wooden frame scuffed from years of use. "If you want it, start now. No fuss, no promises." He turned back to his glass, dismissing her without another glance. Tanya nodded, her heart pounding, but her resolve unshaken. She didn't need his warmth or their approval. She needed a chance, and she'd claw her way to it if she had to. She hung her coat on a hook by the kitchen, rolled up her sleeves, and stepped into the fray. The diner buzzed with the clatter of plates and the low hum of gossip, but Tanya moved with purpose. She wiped tables until they gleamed, refilled coffee pots with a steady hand, and carried trays of steaming biscuits to tables where customers barely acknowledged her. But the weight of their stares never lifted. Each glance, each whispered comment, was a reminder that she was an outsider, marked by her skin and her silence. Near noon, as she delivered a plate of fried eggs and grits to an older man with a gray beard and a scowl, he looked up, his eyes cold. "You know how to cook, girl?" he asked, his voice dripping with disdain. "Or you just slinging whatever slop they got back there? This ain't no slum kitchen." The words hit like a slap, sharp and deliberate. Tanya froze, her hand still on the plate, her pulse hammering in her ears. The diner seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her to crumble or snap. She could feel the eyes on her, the smirks waiting to bloom. But Tanya had learned long ago that anger was a luxury she couldn't afford. She straightened, her gaze locking onto the man's for a fleeting moment, and set the plate down with a deliberate calm that belied the storm in her chest. "I can cook, sir," she said, her voice low but steady. "You'll see." She turned away, her boots clicking on the worn linoleum, and headed back to the kitchen. The man snorted, but Tanya didn't look back. Inside, the heat from the stove wrapped around her like an old friend, and she gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles tight. She wasn't here to win their love or their apologies. She was here to work, to survive, to prove something, not to them, but to herself. As the day wore on, Tanya moved through the diner like a shadow, efficient and unyielding. She scrubbed grease from pans, chopped onions with precision, and kept the coffee flowing. But the whispers followed her, a constant hum of judgment that buzzed like flies. She ignored them, focusing on the rhythm of her tasks, the familiar comfort of a job done well. Yet in the quiet moments, when the kitchen was still and the customers' voices faded, she felt a fire kindling deep within. A resolve to show them who she was, not through words but through the work of her hands. The day ended with the sun sinking low, casting long shadows across the diner's windows. Tanya stood by the sink, washing the last of the dishes, her hands raw from hot water and soap. Henry passed by, tossing a curt nod her way, closer to approval than anything she'd gotten all day. She dried her hands, pulled on her coat, and stepped out into the cold, the wind biting at her face. The town stretched before her, indifferent and unwelcoming. But Tanya's spine remained straight, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She had taken her first steps, and though the path was rough, she knew one thing for certain: she would not turn back. The air inside the southern table was thick with the scent of sizzling bacon and brewing coffee. But beneath the familiar hum of the diner lay a sharper edge, a tension that clung to Tanya like damp cloth. Each morning she stepped through the door, her scarf tucked tight and her resolve tighter, ready to face another day of scrubbing, serving, and swallowing the bitterness of disdain. The first week had tested her, with its barrage of sidelong glances and muttered slights. But Tanya had endured worse in the city: factory foremen who barked orders, neighbors who turned away when she passed. Here, though, the prejudice was quieter, woven into the rhythm of clinking plates and forced smiles, and it cut deeper for its subtlety. She moved through the diner with a precision born of necessity, her hands steady as she wiped down tables, refilled coffee pots, and carried trays laden with biscuits and gravy. The customers, a mix of farmers, shopkeepers, and retirees, ate heartily, but their eyes rarely met hers. When they did, it was with a flicker of judgment, as if her presence behind the counter was an intrusion, a stain on the diner's faded but familiar charm. Tanya kept her head high, her lips pressed into a line that was neither smile nor scowl. She had learned long ago that showing too much, anger, hurt, even pride, gave people a weapon to wield against her. The kitchen became her refuge, a small kingdom of cast-iron skillets and simmering pots where she could lose herself in the work. She chopped onions with a rhythm that steadied her pulse, stirred cornbread batter with a focus that drowned out the whispers beyond the swinging door. Her dishes were simple: collard greens braised with ham hock, cornbread with a golden crust, creamy grits that clung to the spoon, but they carried the soul of her grandmother's recipes, the ones she'd memorized as a girl standing on a stool in a cramped apartment kitchen. Each plate she sent out was a quiet defiance, a proof of her skill that no one could deny, even if they refused to acknowledge it. But the diner's patrons were not so easily swayed. On her third day, as she set a plate of fried eggs before a wiry man with a tobacco-stained beard, he leaned back, his chair creaking, and fixed her with a sneer. "This what you call food?" he said, loud enough for the nearby tables to turn. "Looks like something scraped out of some slum kitchen." The words landed like a blow, sharp and deliberate, and a ripple of chuckles spread through the room. Tanya's fingers tightened on the tray, her knuckles paling, but she didn't flinch. She met his gaze for a heartbeat, her eyes burning with a fire she kept tightly leashed, and said nothing. She turned back to the kitchen, her boots steady on the linoleum, but inside her heart thundered, each beat a vow to prove him wrong. The slights piled up, small but relentless, like pebbles in a shoe. A woman in a floral dress refused to touch her coffee until Tanya cleaned the pot proper, as if her hands carried some invisible taint. A group of young men snickered when she passed, one muttering about folks who don't belong in decent places. Tanya absorbed each one, storing them in a corner of her mind where they fueled her resolve. She worked harder, faster, her movements a silent rebuttal to their doubts. She scrubbed the counter until it gleamed, plated meals with a care that bordered on reverence, and kept the diner running smoother than it had in weeks. Yet the respect she earned was grudging, measured in fewer complaints rather than words of praise. By the end of the week, exhaustion had settled into her bones, but it was the weight of their disdain that pressed heaviest. She was wiping down a table, the rag damp in her hand, when a new customer, a heavy-set man with a red cap and a voice that carried, ordered her soup. She brought it out, a steaming bowl of black-eyed pea soup she'd simmered with smoked turkey and herbs, its aroma rich enough to turn heads. He took one look, sniffed, and pushed it away. "Smells like yesterday's leftovers," he said, his tone dripping with contempt. "You sure you know what you're doing back there?" The diner fell quiet, the clatter of forks pausing as eyes darted between Tanya and the man. Her chest tightened, a familiar ache of humiliation and rage. She could feel the weight of their expectations, waiting for her to bow her head, to retreat. But something snapped inside her, a thread of patience worn too thin. She had endured their whispers, their sneers, their assumptions that her skin defined her worth. No more. Tanya straightened, her gaze locking onto the man's. "That's my soup," she said, her voice low but clear, cutting through the silence like a blade. "Made fresh this morning. If you don't like it, you're welcome to leave. But if you stay, I'll make you something that'll change your mind." She stepped closer, setting a fresh bowl before him, her hands steady despite the tremor in her pulse. Her words hung in the air, a challenge and a promise, and for a moment the diner seemed to hold its breath. The man Carl blinked, his bravado faltering under the intensity of her stare. He opened his mouth, then closed it, his face flushing as the weight of her defiance settled over him. The other customers shifted in their seats, some exchanging glances, others staring at their plates. A few leaned forward, intrigued, as if seeing Tanya for the first time. Carl muttered something under his breath, pushed back his chair and left, the bell above the door jangling in his wake. The room exhaled and the hum of conversation resumed, but it was different now, tinged with curiosity, even unease. Tanya turned back to the kitchen, her heart still racing, but a spark of triumph burned in her chest. She had spoken and they had listened. Not all of them, not yet, but enough to crack the wall of prejudice that surrounded her. She resumed her work, plating meals and refilling coffee, but her movements carried a new confidence, a quiet assertion of her place. The whispers didn't stop, but they softened, and a few customers began to linger over her dishes, their forks scraping plates clean. By the day's end, as she scrubbed the last of the pots, Tanya felt a shift, subtle but real. A woman who'd barely spoken to her before nodded as she left, her eyes meeting Tanya's for a fleeting moment. A farmer at the counter took a second helping of her cornbread, saying nothing but leaving a larger tip than usual. These were not apologies, not yet, but they were signs, cracks in the armor of their disdain. Tanya dried her hands, her fingers raw but her spirit unbroken, and stepped into the kitchen to prepare for the next day's menu. She stood by the stove, stirring a pot of collards, the steam curling around her like a shield. The diner beyond the door buzzed with its usual rhythm, but Tanya no longer felt like a shadow passing through it. She had claimed her ground, not with shouts or tears, but with a bowl of soup and a voice that refused to be silenced. The road ahead was long, and she knew the whispers would linger, but for the first time, she felt the weight of possibility. She was more than their assumptions, more than the color of her skin. She was Tanya, and she would make them see her, one plate at a time. The air in the southern table carried a new undercurrent, a hum of curiosity that trailed Tanya like a shadow as she moved through the diner. Her bold stand with Carl had cracked the veneer of disdain, and though the whispers of prejudice lingered, they were quieter now, edged with something closer to intrigue. Tanya felt it in the way some customers lingered over their plates, their forks scraping clean, or in the fleeting glances that held less scorn. But she didn't let it soften her guard. Respect, she knew, was a fragile thing, easily shattered by a single misstep, and she was determined to carve it out with her own hands. Each morning she arrived before the sun, her boots crunching on the frosty ground, her breath clouding in the pre-dawn chill. The kitchen was her domain, a sanctuary of simmering pots and sizzling skillets, where she poured her defiance into every dish. She cooked with a precision that bordered on reverence, her grandmother's recipes woven with the skills she'd honed in city kitchens. Her black-eyed pea soup was rich with smoked turkey, her collard greens tender with a hint of vinegar, her cornbread golden and sweet enough to hush even the grumpiest patron. Each plate was a statement, a testament to her worth that no one could dismiss, even if they refused to speak it aloud. The customers noticed, though they were slow to admit it. A farmer who'd once pushed her grits aside now ate every bite, his plate clean before he left. A woman in a Sunday hat, who'd barely acknowledged Tanya before, took a second slice of cornbread, her fingers brushing the plate with a hesitance that spoke of surprise. The diner grew busier, the clatter of plates and murmur of voices filling the air, and Tanya's hands never stopped, chopping, stirring, plating, her rhythm a quiet rebellion against the doubts that still hung in the room. But the weight of their earlier slights hadn't vanished. Some patrons still eyed her with suspicion, their politeness thin as cracked ice. A group of men at the counter muttered when she passed, their words too low to catch but sharp enough to sting. Tanya absorbed it, her jaw tight, and channeled the hurt into her work. She wasn't here for their approval, she reminded herself, but for the chance to prove something deeper. To herself, to the girl she'd been, who'd stood in her mother's kitchen dreaming of a life beyond survival. One gray afternoon, as rain tapped the diner's windows, Tanya was behind the counter, pouring coffee with a steady hand, when a familiar face appeared at the door. John, a wiry man with a quick tongue and a history of cutting remarks, stepped inside, his coat damp and his eyes avoiding hers. He'd been one of the loudest to mock her early on, his jabs about slum cooking, drawing laughs from the crowd. Now he slid onto a stool, his shoulders hunched, and stared at the menu board as if it held some secret he couldn't decipher. Tanya watched him, her rag pausing on the counter, her pulse quickening with a mix of wariness and resolve. She knew men like John, quick to wound, slow to bend, but she also knew the power of her craft. Without a word, she moved to the kitchen, her movements deliberate, and began preparing a bowl of soup. It was her lentil stew, thick with carrots and spiced with a pinch of cayenne, the kind of dish that warmed the bones and silenced doubts. She ladled it carefully, the steam curling like a promise, and carried it to John's stool. He looked up, startled, as she set the bowl before him. I wanted to try that soup, he mumbled, his voice barely audible, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his cap. The one I skipped last time. Tanya nodded, her expression unreadable, and stepped back, her arms crossed. The diner was quieter now, the lunchtime rush fading, and a few patrons glanced over, sensing the weight of the moment. John lifted the spoon, his movements hesitant, as if the act of eating her food was a concession he wasn't ready to make. He took a sip, then another, his brow furrowing as the flavors settled on his tongue. The room seemed to hold its breath, the clink of a distant fork the only sound. Tanya stood still, her gaze steady, her heart a drumbeat in her chest. She didn't expect gratitude, didn't need it, but she wanted him to taste the truth in that bowl, the hours she'd spent perfecting it, the pride she'd poured into every ingredient. John set the spoon down, his eyes lifting to meet hers. For a moment he said nothing, his face a map of conflicting emotions. Shame, surprise, something softer. Then in a voice rough with reluctance, he spoke. Tanya, I'm sorry for what I said before. About your cooking. This, he gestured to the bowl, his hand unsteady. This is real good. You're real good. The words hung in the air, raw and unguarded, and Tanya felt a rush of something she hadn't expected. Not triumph, but a quiet peace. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. She nodded once, her lips curving just enough to acknowledge his words, and turned back to the counter, her rag resuming its work. John's apology wasn't a victory, not in the way some might measure it, but it was a crack in the wall, a proof that her skill could shift the ground beneath even the hardest hearts. The moment rippled through the diner, subtle but undeniable. A woman at a nearby table glanced at Tanya, her expression softening. A man who'd never spoken to her before asked for a second helping of her collards, his voice gruff but polite. The changes were small, fragile, but they were there, and Tanya felt them like sparks catching on dry tinder. She moved through the rest of the day with a new rhythm, her hands steadier, her shoulders lighter, as if the weight of their disdain had begun to lift. That evening, as the last customers left and the diner fell quiet, Tanya stood in the kitchen, cleaning the stove with a care that bordered on ritual. She opened a small notebook, its pages worn from use, and began to write. It wasn't just recipes, lentil stew, cornbread, peach cobbler, but lessons, truths she'd gleaned from the fire of her days. Cornbread needs patience to rise, she wrote, her pencil steady. So do we. The words were for her, a reminder of the strength she carried, the dreams she refused to let die. She closed the notebook, tucking it behind a sack of flour, and looked out at the empty diner. The tables gleamed, the air still warm with the memory of her cooking. John's words echoed in her mind, not because they were profound, but because they were a beginning. She had faced their doubts, their cruelty, and turned them into something else. Respect, however grudging, earned through the work of her hands. The fire in her kitchen wasn't just in the stove. It was in her, burning bright and unyielding, ready to light the way forward. The hum of the southern table had changed, its rhythm now laced with a grudging respect that followed Tanya like a faint echo. John's apology, raw and unexpected, had shifted something in the diner's air, and though prejudice still lingered in the tight-lipped stares of some patrons, others began to see her, not as a shadow behind the counter, but as a woman whose hands turned simple ingredients into meals that silenced complaints. Tanya felt the difference in the fuller plates returned to the kitchen, the quieter mutters, the occasional nod from a customer who'd once looked away. But she didn't rest on these small victories. Respect was a flame that needed tending, and she poured her energy into every dish, every scrub table, every early morning spent stoking the stove. Her days were a blur of motion, chopping vegetables with a steady knife, stirring pots of collard greens until they sang with flavor, baking cornbread that crumbled just right. The diner's crowds grew, drawn by whispers of her food, and Tanya met the demand with a focus that burned brighter than exhaustion. She wasn't just cooking, she was claiming her place, proving her worth with every plate that left the kitchen. Yet even as the diner thrived, a restless dream stirred in her chest. She wanted more than a borrowed counter, more than a space where her presence was tolerated rather than celebrated. She wanted a table of her own, a haven where no one would be judged by the color of their skin or the weight of their past. Tanya began to save, tucking away every spare coin from her wages, her fingers brushing the small notebook where she recorded recipes and truths. The pages held more than measurements for peach cobbler or chicken stew. They held her resolve, her vision of a place where warmth and dignity were served alongside every meal. Late at night, when the diner was empty and the world quiet, She counted her savings, the clink of coins a promise of something greater. It was slow, painstaking work, but Tanya had never been afraid of hard roads. By the end of winter, the diner's success was undeniable, its tables packed with patrons who came for her food, even if they didn't always admit it. Her pecan pie, with its caramelized crust, disappeared before noon. Her chicken and dumplings, rich with herbs, drew murmurs of surprise from even the surliest regulars. The respect she'd earned was no longer fragile. It was a foundation, built on the strength of her craft. But Tanya knew her time at the southern table was drawing to a close. She wasn't meant to stay in someone else's kitchen, fighting for scraps of approval. She was meant to build something new. With her savings clutched tight, Tanya leased a small storefront down the road, its windows dusty but wide, its walls bare but full of possibility. She spent weeks scrubbing floors, painting shelves, and hauling in a secondhand stove that gleamed under her care. She hung jars of homemade preserves, peach, fig, blackberry, along the walls, their colors catching the light like jewels. The sign above the door, hand-painted in bold letters, read Tanya's table. And when she stepped back to look at it, her heart swelled with a pride she hadn't known she could feel. This was hers, a space where every soul would be welcome, where no one would face the sting of a whispered slight. The opening day was quiet, the air heavy with the scent of cinnamon and smoked brisket. Tanya stood behind the counter, her apron crisp, her hands steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. The first customers trickled in, farmers, shopkeepers, a few curious faces from the diner, and she greeted them with a smile that was neither forced nor guarded, but real. She served plates of cornbread and collards, bowls of red beans and rice, each dish carrying the warmth of her grandmother's kitchen and the precision of her own hard-won skill. The tables filled slowly, the clatter of forks mingling with soft laughter, and Tanya felt a spark of something new, belonging, not just for her, but for everyone who crossed her threshold. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Tanya's table became a haven, its warmth drawing people who'd never set foot in the southern table. A truck driver lingered over her sweet potato pie, his tired eyes softening with each bite. A young couple shared a plate of fried okra, their hands brushing as they laughed. Tanya moved through it all, her presence steady but unobtrusive, her smile a quiet invitation to stay. She didn't demand praise, didn't need it. The empty plates and growing crowds were proof enough of her triumph. One spring afternoon, as the lunch rush faded, Tanya was wiping down the counter when a young woman stepped inside. Her shoulders were hunched, her eyes heavy with a weariness Tanya recognized, the weight of a past that refused to let go. She approached the counter, her steps hesitant, and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Can you help me?" she asked, her words trembling. "I feel worthless. My past, it's all people see. They look at me like I'm nothing." Tanya paused, her rag still in hand, and met the girl's gaze. She saw herself in those eyes, the Tanya who'd stood in the southern table, swallowing slights, fighting to be seen. She set the rag down, leaned on the counter, and spoke with a certainty that came from her core. "Nobody decides your worth but you," she said, her voice low but unwavering. "Your past doesn't define you. It's what you do now, what you build that matters. You can rise, and you will." The girl blinked, her eyes glistening, and for a moment, the world seemed to narrow to the space between them. Tanya's words weren't just advice. They were a lifeline, forged in the fire of her own struggles. The girl nodded, a spark of hope flickering in her expression, and slipped out the door, her steps a little lighter. Tanya watched her go, her heart full but steady, knowing that moments like these were why she'd built this place. Tanya's table wasn't just about food. It was about healing, about offering a seat to those who'd been turned away. As evening fell, Tanya stood behind the counter, arranging a fresh batch of biscuits on a tray. The diner glowed with soft light, the air rich with the aroma of her cooking. Customers lingered, their voices weaving a tapestry of connection that filled the space. She opened her notebook, its pages now thick with recipes and reflections, and added a new line. "A table isn't just wood and nails. It's where you find your strength." She closed it, her fingers brushing the worn cover, and looked out at the room she'd created. Tanya's table was more than a dream fulfilled. It was a rebellion against every doubt, every sneer, every moment she'd been made to feel small. She had built it with her hands, her heart, her unyielding will, and now it stood as a beacon for anyone who needed refuge. The customers who filled her tables didn't just eat her food, they carried her story, her truth, out into the world. Tanya straightened, her apron dusted with flour, and moved to greet a new face at the door. She was home, and she was ready to keep building, one plate, one soul, at a time. The rhythm of Tanya's table pulsed with a life of its own, a heartbeat of clinking plates, soft laughter, and the warm hum of voices that filled the air like a song. Months had passed since Tanya opened her doors, and the small diner had become a haven, its tables crowded with faces new and familiar, each drawn by the promise of a meal that fed more than the body. Tanya moved through the space with a quiet grace, her apron dusted with flour, her hands steady as she served plates of cornbread and collards, her eyes bright with a pride that needed no words. The prejudice that once shadowed her every step had not vanished entirely, but it had been pushed to the edges, outshone by the undeniable truth of her craft in the sanctuary she'd built. The diner was more than a business. It was a testament to Tanya's defiance, a rebellion against every sneer and slight that had tried to diminish her. She poured her soul into every dish, black-eyed pea stew simmered with care, peach cobbler with a crust that melted on the tongue, fried okra crisp and golden. Each plate carried a piece of her story, a reminder of the woman who'd stood tall in the face of disdain and carved a place where all were welcome. The customers felt it, even those who'd once turned away, and they returned, their forks scraping plates clean, their voices softer, their eyes meeting hers with a respect that had been hard-won. Tanya's days were long, her hands raw from chopping and stirring, but she thrived in the work. She had found a partner in Amos, a quiet farmer with calloused hands and a heart that saw her fully, not as a shadow of her past, but as the woman she was. He worked beside her, chopping vegetables with a careful hand, his presence a steady anchor in the bustle of the diner. Their love was unspoken but evident, in the way he brushed flour from her cheek or the way she saved him the last slice of pie. Together they built a rhythm that made Tanya's table feel like home, not just for them, but for everyone who crossed its threshold. The diner's reputation grew, its warmth drawing travelers and locals alike. A trucker lingered over a bowl of chicken and dumplings, his tired shoulders easing with each bite. A young mother shared biscuits with her children, their giggles filling the air. Tanya watched it all, her heart full but vigilant, knowing the fragility of what she'd created. She didn't seek praise, didn't need it. The crowded tables and empty plates were her reward, a quiet triumph over the voices that had once tried to silence her. One summer evening, as the day's heat lingered and the diner glowed with soft light, Tanya was behind the counter, arranging a tray of fresh cornbread, when a group of teenage girls slipped through the door. They were locals, their faces a mix of curiosity and hesitation, their hands clutching coins saved from chores. Tanya recognized the look in their eyes, the hunger for something more than food, the need to be seen. She waved them to a table, her smile an invitation, and served them plates of red beans and rice, the portions generous, the aroma rich with memory. As they ate, Tanya joined them, her apron loosened, her voice warm but firm. She taught them to knead dough, her hands guiding theirs through the sticky flour, her laughter easing their nerves. "Cooking's like life," she said, her eyes meeting each girl's. "You take what you've got, work it with care, and make something worth sharing." She showed them how to season collards, how to tell when cornbread was ready, but more than that, she shared her truths, how to stand tall when the world tried to shrink you, how to save coins for dreams that felt too big. The girls listened, their eyes wide, their hands steadier with each lesson, and Tanya saw in them the spark she'd once carried, the one that had led her here. The moment was interrupted by a traveler, a wiry man with a weathered hat, who leaned across the counter, his plate empty but his curiosity full. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough but genuine, "how'd you learn to cook like this? Tastes like you've been at it forever." Tanya paused, her rag still in hand, and glanced at Amos, who was slicing onions with a quiet focus. A smile curved her lips, soft but sure. I cooked for folks who didn't know my name, she said, her words deliberate, and learned to make every bite count. Now I cook for those who see me. That's enough. The man nodded, his eyes lingering on her, as if seeing the weight of her words, and returned to his coffee. Tanya turned back to the girls, her lessons resuming, but the traveler's question stayed with her. It wasn't just about cooking, it was about legacy, about the mark she was leaving on the world. She opened her notebook, its pages thick with recipes and reflections, and added a new line. A meal feeds the body, but a table feeds the soul. The words were for her, a reminder of why she kept going, why she refused to let the past define her. As the evening wound down, the diner emptied, leaving only the hum of the stove and the soft clink of dishes Tanya washed. Amos joined her, his hands gentle as he dried plates, their silence comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. The girls had left with flour-dusted hands and brighter eyes, clutching scraps of paper with Tanya's recipes and words of courage. Tanya felt a quiet pride, not for the diner's success, but for the lives she was touching, the spark she was kindling in others. She stepped to the counter, her notebook open, and traced the lines she'd written over months. Recipes for stew, for pie, for survival. Each was a piece of her journey, from the slights she'd endured to the haven she'd built. She thought of the girls, of the traveler, of every soul who'd found refuge at her tables, and knew her work was far from done. Tanya's table was a beacon, a place where prejudice was met with dignity, where pasts were left at the door, and where every plate carried a story of resilience. As she locked the door, the night air cool against her skin, Tanya paused, her hand resting on the sign above. The letters gleamed, a promise etched in paint and will. She had faced the world's cruelty and turned it into something beautiful, not just for herself, but for those who needed it most. The girls would carry her lessons, the customers her food, and the diner her heart. She was no longer the woman who'd stood trembling under scorn. She was Tanya, a builder of tables, a keeper of dreams, a woman whose legacy would endure in every bite, every smile, every soul she lifted. The stars above were bright, but Tanya's fire burned brighter, a flame that no darkness could extinguish. She turned back to the diner, its glow a reminder of all she'd achieved, and knew that this, her table, her truth, was only the beginning of what she could give. As Tanya's story comes to a close, her legacy at Tanya's table reminds us that resilience and kindness can transform not just lives, but entire communities. Her journey from facing prejudice to building a haven of hope speaks to the power of standing tall and lifting others along the way. What did Tanya's story stir in you? How do you see her fire burning in your own life? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share them below or with someone close to you. Thank you for joining me on this unforgettable journey through courage and redemption. Until we meet again for another tale, keep carrying your own spark and let it light the way.